1903 Family Portrait Unearthed, and researchers shudder when they zoom in on the baby. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the old Victorian house in Portland, Maine, as Jennifer and her brother Michael climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Their grandmother had passed away 3 months earlier, and the task of sorting through a century's worth of family belongings had fallen to them. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light streaming through a small circular window, illuminating boxes stacked haphazardly against the sloped walls. "I can't believe she kept all of this," Michael said, pulling open a trunk filled with yellowed newspapers and moth-eaten quilts. Jennifer knelt beside a leather suitcase, its brass clasps green with age. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, she found a collection of photographs. Most were from the 1940s and 50s. Her grandmother as a young woman, wedding photos, children in Sunday clothes. But at the bottom, in a separate envelope marked with faded ink that read, "Do not open," Jennifer discovered something different. The photograph was mounted on thick cardboard, the edges worn soft with time. "Michael, look at this," she whispered. Her brother moved closer, wiping dust from his hands. The image showed a formal family portrait, the kind taken in professional studios at the turn of the century. A man and woman sat rigidly in wooden chairs, their faces stern and unsmiling as was the fashion. The woman held an infant wrapped in an elaborate white christening gown. Standing behind them were two older adults, presumably grandparents, and a young girl of perhaps 5 years old. "That must be from around 1900, Michael said, squinting at the faded sepia tones. "Look at those clothes." The family wore their finest, the man in a dark suit with a high collar, the woman in a dress with leg of mutton sleeves, her hair piled high on her head. But something about the photograph felt odd, though Jennifer couldn't immediately identify what. "Why would grandmother hide this?" she asked, turning the frame over. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, "The Thornton Family, Augusta, Maine, February 1903. Below that, in different handwriting, darker and more recent, "Some truths are meant to stay buried." Jennifer felt a chill despite the stuffy warmth of the attic. She looked again at the solemn faces staring back from more than a century ago, at the baby whose features were barely visible in the folds of the gown. "We should have this restored," she said, "maybe scanned digitally. There might be family history here we never knew." Michael nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the warning scrawled on the back. 2 weeks later, Jennifer sat in the small office of Digital Heritage Restoration in downtown Portland. The space was cramped but organized, filled with computer monitors displaying old photographs in various stages of repair. Thomas Brennan, the owner, was a man in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and gentle hands that handled old photographs like sacred objects. "This is remarkable quality for 1903, he said, examining the Thornton family portrait under a magnifying lamp. "Whoever took this was a skilled photographer. The focus is exceptionally sharp." He looked up at Jennifer. "What would you like me to do with it?" "I want a high-resolution scan," Jennifer explained, "and if possible, enhancement. I'd like to see their faces more clearly, maybe bring out some of the details that have faded." She hesitated. There was a note on the back. A warning, actually. It made me curious. Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "I'll treat it with the utmost care. The scanning process is non-invasive. I use specialized equipment that won't damage the original." He carefully placed the photograph on a flatbed scanner designed specifically for archival materials. "This will take about an hour. The resolution will be high enough that you'll be able to see details invisible to the naked eye." Jennifer watched as the scanner's light passed slowly beneath the glass. The process was meditative, almost hypnotic. When it finished, Thomas transferred the file to his computer and opened it in professional editing software. The image appeared on the screen, vastly larger and clearer than the physical photograph. "Now," Thomas said, adjusting his glasses, "let's see what we have here." He began working with various tools, adjusting contrast, carefully sharpening details, removing the yellow cast of age. The faces of the family members emerged with startling clarity. The man's eyes were gray and tired. The woman's hands, holding the baby, were thin and marked with calluses. The grandmother in the back had a small scar on her chin. "Can you zoom in on the baby?" Jennifer asked. Something about the infant had caught her attention, a feeling more than a specific observation. Thomas complied, enlarging the section of the image that showed the child's face and the small hand that had slipped free from the christening gown. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas leaned closer to the screen, his expression shifting from professional interest to genuine surprise. "That's unusual," he said quietly. He zoomed in further, enhancing the resolution until the baby's tiny hand filled the screen. Jennifer's breath caught. What am I looking at? But even as she asked, she could see it. Something about the child's eyes and hand that seemed wrong, impossible. Thomas sat back in his chair, staring at the screen with a mixture of fascination and concern. He zoomed in even further on the baby's face, adjusting the sharpness and contrast. The eyes became startlingly clear, one a deep brown, almost black, the other a pale, crystalline blue. The difference was unmistakable. Heterochromia, Thomas said softly. Two different colored eyes. It's rare but not unheard of. He moved the view to the baby's hand. But this is something else. The tiny fingers, no longer than an inch in the original photograph, now revealed extraordinary detail. The iris of the pale blue eye showed a distinctive feature, a keyhole-shaped gap, a missing section that made the pupil appear irregularly shaped. What causes that? Jennifer asked, leaning closer to the monitor. Her heart was beating faster now, though she couldn't explain why the image disturbed her so deeply. It's called coloboma, Thomas explained, a congenital defect where part of the eye structure doesn't form completely. It can affect the iris, retina, even the optic nerve. He glanced at Jennifer. But what concerns me more is the context. In 1903, a child with visible physical differences like this. He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Jennifer understood. She'd done enough genealogical research to know that the early 20th century was an era of brutal prejudice against anyone deemed physically or mentally defective. Children with disabilities were hidden away, institutionalized, sometimes worse. You think that's why the photograph was hidden? She asked. Possibly. Thomas zoomed out to show the full family portrait again. Look at how they're positioned. The baby is turned slightly away from the camera. The christening gown is wrapped tightly, covering the hands almost completely. This one hand slipping out. That might have been accidental. He pointed to the faces of the parents. And look at their expressions. They're not just following the convention of serious portrait poses. They look frightened. Jennifer studied the faces with new understanding. The mother's grip on the baby seemed protective, almost desperate. The father's jaw was clenched, his eyes hard. Even the young girl standing behind them had an expression that Jennifer now recognized as anxiety rather than childish solemnity. I need to know more about this family, Jennifer said. The Thornton family from Augusta, 1903. There has to be some record. She pulled out her phone and took a photo of the screen. May I have a copy of this scan? Thomas nodded and transferred the file to a thumb drive. I should warn you, he said as he handed it to her. Sometimes family histories contain things we'd rather not discover. That warning on the back of the photograph, someone wanted this forgotten. Jennifer thanked him and left the office, but his words stayed with her. Outside, the October afternoon had turned gray and cold. She walked to her car, her mind racing with questions. The Maine Historical Society occupied a stately brick building near Congress Square. Jennifer had called ahead, explaining that she was researching her family history and needed access to records from the early 1900s. The archivist who greeted her was a woman named Patricia, probably in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. The Thornton family from Augusta, Patricia repeated, leading Jennifer down a hallway lined with portraits of notable Maine citizens. That's not a common name in this area, but we should have something. They entered a research room with long wooden tables and rows of filing cabinets. Patricia disappeared into the stacks and returned with several bound volumes and a box of loose documents. Census records, city directories, newspaper archives, she explained, setting them on the table. Start with the 1900 census and work forward. If your family was in Augusta in 1903, they should appear. She handed Jennifer a pair of white cotton gloves for handling the documents. Jennifer began with the 1900 census. She found the Thornton family on the third page she examined. James Thornton, age 29, occupation clerk. Wife Clara, age 27. Daughter Ruth, age 3. They lived on Grove Street in Augusta, but there was no mention of a baby born in or around 1903. She moved to the 1910 census. The family had grown. James, now 39, Clara 37, Ruth 13, and... Jennifer stopped, her finger on the page. There were 2 other children listed, Robert, age 9, and Sarah, age 6. But no child born around 1903. The missing child would have been 7 years old in 1910. Finding what you need? Patricia asked, appearing beside her. "I'm finding what's not here," Jennifer replied. She showed the archivist the two census records. "There should be another child, a baby born around 1903. She pulled out her phone and showed Patricia the digital photograph. "This is a family portrait from February 1903. You can see the infant." Patricia studied the image, then looked at the census records. Her expression grew thoughtful. "Let me check the birth records." She left and returned 20 minutes later with a large ledger. She opened it to 1903 and ran her finger down the entries. "Here, Thornton, male child, born January 28, 1903. Parents James and Clara Thornton." She paused. "But there's a notation." Jennifer leaned forward. Next to the birth entry, in different ink, someone had written, "Died March 15, 1903. Jennifer stared at the death notation, her mind working through the implications. A child born in late January, photographed in February, officially dead by mid-March. Yet the photograph showed a healthy infant, alert and well cared for, wrapped in an expensive christening gown. Nothing about the image suggested a sickly child near death. "May I see death records for March 1903? Jennifer asked. Patricia nodded and retrieved another ledger. They found the entry. "Thornton, male infant, March 15, 1903. Cause, respiratory failure." But something about the record felt wrong. The handwriting was slightly different from the other entries on the page, and the ink color didn't quite match. "This looks like it was added later," Patricia observed, her archivist's eye catching what Jennifer had only sensed. "See how the entry sits slightly above the line? And the ink has a different oxidation pattern." She looked at Jennifer with newfound interest. Someone wanted this child officially dead, but they may not have actually died. Jennifer's pulse quickened. Is there a cemetery record? A burial plot? They spent the next hour searching through cemetery records from Augusta and surrounding towns. Nothing. No grave for an infant Thornton in March 1903. Patricia pulled out city directories from 1904 through 1910, cross-referencing addresses. The Thornton family lived on Grove Street through 1905, Patricia said, tracing entries with her finger. Then they moved. Not to another address in Augusta. They left entirely. She found them next in Portland directories, starting in 1906. They relocated about 50 miles away and changed their church affiliation, St. Michael's Episcopal in Augusta to First Parish Congregational in Portland. "People running from something," Jennifer said softly. "Or protecting something," Patricia corrected. She looked again at the photograph on Jennifer's phone, zooming in on the baby's distinctive eyes. In 1903, children with visible physical abnormalities were often taken from their families. The eugenics movement was gaining strength. Maine had one of the first state institutions for the feeble-minded. It opened in 1908, but the attitudes that led to it existed earlier. Jennifer felt sick. "You think they faked their child's death to protect him?" "It's possible. Families did desperate things to keep their children." Patricia closed the ledgers and looked at Jennifer directly. "But if that's true, where did the child go? He's not in the 1910 census with the family. He's not in any Portland records I can see." Jennifer thought about the warning on the back of the photograph. Some truths are meant to stay buried. Her grandmother had written that, probably decades after the events, which meant she had known. "I need to find out what happened to him." Jennifer returned to her grandmother's house that evening with new purpose. If her grandmother had known the truth, there might be other clues hidden in the house. She searched the parlor where old family documents had been kept, pulling books from shelves, checking inside drawers she'd previously only glanced through. Michael arrived just as darkness fell. "You sounded urgent on the phone," he said, finding her surrounded by boxes and papers in the dining room. Jennifer explained everything she'd discovered: the census records, the suspicious death entry, the family's sudden move to Portland. "So, we had a great-great-uncle who officially died but probably didn't," Michael said, processing the information. "Where do you think he went?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." Jennifer opened another box, this one filled with old prayer books and religious materials. At the bottom, wrapped in faded silk, she found what she'd been hoping for: the family Bible. It was massive, leather-bound, with metal clasps. The pages were gilt-edged, and between them pressed flowers and ribbons marked significant passages. She carried it to the dining table and carefully opened it. The family record pages were in the front, as was traditional. Births, marriages, deaths, all recorded in careful handwriting. She found James and Clara's marriage, June 12, 1896. Ruth's birth, April 3, 1897, Robert's birth, August 15, 1900. Sarah's birth, March 22, 1904. But between Robert and Sarah, there was an entry that had been scratched out, the ink scraped away with something sharp. Jennifer held the page up to the light, trying to make out what had been written. She could see fragments. January 1903. And what might have been a name beginning with E. Someone tried to erase him from the family record, Michael said, looking over her shoulder. He took out his phone and turned on the flashlight, angling it across the page. The oblique light revealed indentations in the paper where the pen had pressed through. Edward, he read. Edward Thornton, born January 28, 1903. Jennifer felt a strange mix of triumph and sadness. Edward. The baby in the photograph had a name, but someone had tried to remove him from history, to make it as if he'd never existed. She turned more pages, looking for anything else related to Edward. Tucked between Psalms and Proverbs, she found a letter, folded small and yellowed with age. Jennifer's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The paper was brittle, threatening to crack along the creases. The handwriting was feminine, elegant but hurried, written in ink that had faded to brown. My dearest Clara, it began. Jennifer recognized the date at the top, July 16, 1903. Nearly 5 months after the photograph was taken, 4 months after Edward's supposed death. I received your letter, and I understand the impossible position you face. The rumors in Augusta have not ceased, and I fear you are right that staying would endanger not only Edward but Ruth and Robert as well. The things people say about children like Edward, that they are cursed, that they carry the devil's mark, that they bring misfortune to families. These superstitions run deep in small communities. I have spoken with Thomas about your situation. He has agreed to help, though it breaks his heart as much as mine. The cabin in Aroostook County remains empty since our father passed. It is remote, accessible only by rough roads, but it has everything needed for basic living. More importantly, it is far from prying eyes and cruel tongues. Thomas will travel to Portland next month to finalize the arrangements. He suggests you continue to maintain the story that Edward died. It is harsh, but it may be the only way to protect him and give him a chance at some kind of life. Thomas and I have no children of our own, as you know. We can provide Edward with care, though we cannot give him the life you would have wished for him. I know this decision torments you. I see it in every word you write. But Clara, you must think of Ruth and Robert. If you keep Edward, the whispers will follow your family everywhere. The other children will suffer. They will be marked as siblings to a defective child, and doors will close to them. Marriages will be denied. Employment will be refused. This is the world we live in, cruel though it is. You are not abandoning Edward. You are giving him the gift of safety and giving your other children the gift of a normal life. Thomas and I will love him as our own. You have my sacred promise. The letter was signed, Your devoted sister Margaret. Jennifer read it twice, then a third time, each reading making her feel hollower. Michael sat beside her, silent, absorbing the implications. They gave him away, he finally said, to the mother's sister and her husband, to raise in secret. To protect everyone, Jennifer replied, though the words tasted bitter. She understood the impossible choice Clara Thornton had faced in 1903. A child with visible differences, heterochromia, coloboma, would have been treated as a freak, an object of suspicion and disgust. His siblings would have been tainted by association, but understanding didn't make it less heartbreaking. Aroostook County, Michael said, pulling out his phone to search. That's way up north, near the Canadian border. Logging country, farming country. Very isolated, especially back then. He looked at Jennifer. Do you want to find him? Find what happened to Edward? Jennifer thought about the photograph, about the baby's mismatched eyes looking into a future his parents feared he couldn't have. Yes, she said. I think he deserves to be remembered, to be part of the family history, not erased from it. 3 days later, Jennifer and Michael drove north on Route 1, leaving the coast behind as they headed inland toward Aroostook County. The landscape changed gradually, the rocky shores and fishing villages giving way to dense forests of pine and birch, then to rolling farmland and vast potato fields, harvested now in late October. They'd done their research. Margaret's married name was Sullivan. Her husband Thomas had indeed owned property in Aroostook County, inherited from his father who'd worked in the lumber industry. County land records showed a small parcel near the town of Ashland, deep in the woods, accessible by what was marked on old maps as a logging road. The drive took 7 hours. They stopped in Ashland as darkness fell, checking into a small motel that looked unchanged since the 1960s. Over dinner at the only restaurant in town, Jennifer showed the owner, an elderly man named Frank, the photograph on her phone. "I'm trying to trace my family history," she explained. "The Sullivans, Thomas and Margaret. They might have lived in a cabin outside town around 1903 or so." Frank studied the image, his weathered face thoughtful. "Sullivan's a common enough name up here. Lots of Irish came to work the lumber camps." He zoomed in on Edward's face, squinting at the screen. "That's quite something, those eyes. 2 different colors. And what's that in the blue one? Looks odd." "A birth defect," Jennifer said carefully. "Coloboma. We think his family sent him away because of it." Frank's expression softened with understanding. People were cruel about such things back then. More than cruel. He handed back the phone. "There's an old-timer might help you. Agnes Porter. She's 93, sharp as a tack. Her grandfather logged these woods in the old days. If there was a family living isolated out there, he might have known about it." They found Agnes the next morning in a small cottage surrounded by white birch trees. She was tiny, bird-like, with fierce blue eyes and hands twisted by arthritis. She invited them in and served strong coffee while Jennifer explained their search. "The Sullivan place," Agnes said immediately when Jennifer mentioned the location. "Oh yes, I remember my grandfather speaking of it. Strange situation, he always said. Couple living way out there with a boy they claimed was their nephew, but who never came to town, never went to school." She looked at the photograph. "That would be him, I expect. The boy with the unusual eyes." Agnes settled into her armchair, her gnarled hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "My grandfather was a timber cruiser. He surveyed forest land for the lumber companies. He knew every cabin and camp in these woods. He mentioned the Sullivan place several times over the years, always with a note of sadness in his voice." Jennifer leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. "What did he say about them?" "That they were good people in a bad situation. Thomas Sullivan worked odd jobs, some carpentry, some guiding for hunters, some farm work in summer. Margaret kept the cabin and raised the boy. But they were isolated, even by Aroostook standards. The boy couldn't be seen. Those eyes of his. In those days, people would have called him cursed or worse." Agnes paused, her gaze distant. "My grandfather said he met the boy once, by accident. He was surveying timber near the Sullivan cabin in 1912 or so. Would have made the boy about 9 years old. Found him by a stream, fishing. Grandfather said the boy started like a frightened deer when he realized someone had seen him, but grandfather talked gentle to him, asked about the fishing, said the boy was smart, articulate, lonely as hell." Michael pulled out his notebook. "Do you know what happened to him? To Edward?" Agnes nodded slowly. "Edward. Yes, that was his name. Grandfather learned it later. The boy grew up in that cabin, never went to school formally, but Margaret taught him to read and write. Thomas taught him woodcraft, how to live off the land. By the time he was 15, Edward could track better than most men, could identify every plant and animal in the forest." She sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "The First World War changed things. Thomas Sullivan enlisted in 1917, even though he was in his 40s. He didn't come back. Killed at Belleau Wood. Margaret and Edward stayed in the cabin, but it was harder without Thomas's income. Then, in 1919, the influenza pandemic hit." Jennifer felt her stomach drop. "Did Edward?" "No," Agnes said firmly. "Margaret died. The flu took her in November 1919. Edward was 16, alone in that cabin, and winter was coming." She set down her cup. "My grandfather found out through people in town. He went to the cabin, brought the boy out. Edward had been living alone for 2 weeks, surviving on what he could hunt and trap." "What happened to him?" Jennifer asked. Agnes smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Grandfather brought him to our family farm. My father was 12 at the time. He helped hide Edward, because that's what it still required, hiding him. My grandfather wasn't going to let the boy be institutionalized, not after everything he'd survived. So Edward lived in our barn loft for a winter, then moved to a small cabin on the back of our property." Agnes stood slowly, supporting herself on the armrest. "Come with me. There's something you should see." She led Jennifer and Michael to a small study at the back of her cottage. The walls were covered with photographs, family portraits spanning generations, landscapes of the northern Maine wilderness, logging camps, and river drives. But Agnes pointed to a specific photograph, framed and hanging beside the window. It showed a man in his 30s, standing in a forest clearing, holding a large camera on a tripod. His face was handsome, weathered by outdoor life, and his eyes, One brown, one blue with the telltale keyhole shape of Coloboma, looked directly at the camera with quiet confidence. Edward Thornton, Agnes said softly. Taken in 1937. He lived on our family land for the rest of his life, nearly 60 years. He never married, never had children of his own, but he wasn't alone. He became part of our family, my grandfather's unofficial son, my father's adopted brother. Jennifer stared at the photograph, tears blurring her vision. The baby from the 1903 portrait had grown into this man, strong, capable, surviving against all odds. What did he do? Michael asked. How did he live? He became a photographer, Agnes replied. Self-taught, using equipment my grandfather helped him acquire. Edward documented the northern Maine wilderness like no one before or since. The animals, the changing seasons, the logging camps, the Native American communities. His work was remarkable. She gestured to several landscape photographs on the walls. These are his. Museums in Bangor and Portland have collections of his photographs now. They're signed E.T. He never used his full name publicly, but his work spoke for him. She pulled out a worn leather album and opened it. Page after page showed Edward's photographs. Moose standing in misty ponds, winter forests stark and beautiful, loggers at work, Penobscot fishermen on the rivers, and people, portraits of farmers, children, elderly couples, all captured with remarkable empathy and skill. He saw the world differently, Agnes said. Maybe because of his eyes, maybe because of his isolation, but he saw beauty and dignity in everything. He treated his subjects with respect, especially those who were different or marginalized, like he had been. Jennifer turned pages, absorbing the scope of Edward's work and life. Did he ever reconnect with his birth family? With his siblings? Agnes shook her head. Not directly, but he knew about them. My grandfather made quiet inquiries over the years. Ruth, Robert, and Sarah Thornton all grew up, married, had children. They lived normal lives in Portland, never knowing they had a brother hidden in the North Woods. She paused. Edward understood why his parents made the choice they did. He never blamed them, though I think it hurt him deeply. He told my father once that he'd rather live free in the forest than locked in an institution. His parents gave him that chance, even if they couldn't give him their name. Michael was examining the photographs closely. These are extraordinary. He had real talent. He did, Agnes agreed. After he died in 1978, my father donated his entire collection to the Maine State Museum. They had an exhibition of his work in 1982. Critics called him one of the finest documentary photographers of rural Maine in the 20th century. She smiled. He would have appreciated that, I think. Being recognized for what he created, not defined by what made him different. Jennifer looked again at the 1937 photograph of Edward. Behind him in the image, she could just make out a small cabin among the trees, his home, his sanctuary. May I take a photo of this? She asked Agnes. Of course. And I have something else for you. Agnes went to a desk and pulled out a large envelope. Inside were copies of some of Edward's photographs and a handwritten document. Edward wrote about his life near the end. Not a complete autobiography, just memories and reflections. My father kept it. I thought someday someone from his birth family might come looking. I'm glad you did. Jennifer and Michael drove back to Portland in silence, the envelope of Edward's photographs and writings on the seat between them. The autumn sun was setting, painting the forests in shades of amber and gold, the same forests Edward had captured in his photographs. That evening, Jennifer spread everything out on her dining table. The 1903 family portrait, the scanned image showing Edward's distinctive eyes, the letter from Margaret, the photographs of Edward as an adult, and his handwritten memories. Together they told the story of a life that was supposed to have been erased, but had instead created something lasting and beautiful. She thought about Clara Thornton, holding her infant son in that 1903 photograph, knowing she would have to give him up to protect him and her other children, an impossible choice born of an intolerant time. She thought about Margaret and Thomas Sullivan, who gave Edward a home and love in isolation. She thought about Agnes's grandfather, who showed kindness when it mattered most. And she thought about Edward himself, who took the limitations imposed on him and transformed them into art that would outlive everyone who had tried to erase him. The baby with the unusual eyes had seen the world more clearly than most, and he had shared that vision through his camera. Jennifer picked up the 1903 photograph. The warning on the back. Some truths are meant to stay buried, no longer seemed ominous. It seemed sad, a reflection of shame that belonged to the era, not to Edward. This truth didn't need to stay buried anymore. She would write Edward's story, she decided. She would include his photographs in the family archive. She would make sure her own children knew about their great-great-uncle who survived, who created, who refused to be defined by other people's fears and prejudices. The baby in the photograph deserved to be remembered not as a defect or a secret, but as Edward Thornton, brother, artist, survivor, a man who turned isolation into a unique perspective and shared it with the world through his remarkable gift. As darkness fell outside, Jennifer carefully placed all the photographs together in an archival box. Edward's story had been hidden for more than a century, but now it would be told. And perhaps she thought that was a kind of justice. Belated, imperfect, but real. The family portrait from 1903 was no longer a source of shame, but a testament to love, sacrifice, and the extraordinary resilience of one boy with unusual eyes who refused to be forgotten.